Now, on the sidelines of the Nuclear Security Summit in Washington last week, Chinese President Xi Jinping and his U.S. counterpart Barack Obama agreed to step up cooperation to ensure nuclear security worldwide. But in Africa, the priority is different. The continent's economic growth is being stifled by widespread power shortages, resulting in up to 4% loss on GDP, according to one 2015 report. So to close this gap and boost their economies, nations across the continent are hoping to harness nuclear power for peaceful development. So what challenges might we confront in this pursuit? And just how viable an option is a nuclear-powered Africa? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, nuclear power is increasingly being seen as an option to narrow the electricity provision gap in Africa. Exponents of the power source are quick to defend the safety record on nuclear reactors, but perhaps the biggest hurdle remains the exorbitant cost, long construction timelines, and the need for high-level maintenance. South Africa remains the only African country with an established nuclear power capacity, and the government will soon be releasing requests for information, which is the first stage in the procurement process. The aim is to provide some 9,600 megawatts of nuclear power by 2030. CCTV's Angelo Coppola has more.
South Africa has lessons to share, especially around their successful implementation of the renewable energies program in place. Lessons that will be used to build and expand the nuclear sector.
We were importing a whole lot of equipment and systems for the renewable program. We don't want to do the same for nuclear. We want to manufacture locally, and we want to provide the services from South Africa. There will be this transfer of IP, of know-how and know-what from the international vendors to South African companies and state-owned enterprises in terms of doing this program.
But it has to be a reciprocal arrangement so everyone benefits.
International cooperation cannot be a one-sided story where everything is done in one country and everybody else pays for it. So there will have to be an exchange of intellectual property. There will have to be the chance for the countries that opt to build nuclear to actually do their part.
Mutually beneficial partnerships are one of the ways touted to fill the continental power gap.
The intention is to have a partnership with a country and companies that want to help us achieve our outcome. Our outcome is to become a key player in the nuclear industry, to manufacture, to also design systems and components so that they can be exported.
The other part of the equation is the safe maintenance and management of the plant once it's built.
I think every country needs to make sure that it can operate these facilities for the 60-80 years life expectancy in a safe and good manner. And for that, they will have to be able to do the maintenance, to do the refueling, to do the necessary replacement and equipment enhancements that will come about.
Several African countries are exploring their options. An International Atomic Energy Agency mission is scheduled for early 2017 to assess Ghana's nuclear infrastructure ahead of a government decision planned for 2018. The agency is also providing technical support to Algerian experts who are conducting an energy planning study there, while Morocco is considering nuclear power as a long-term energy source.
International nuclear energy providers are scrambling to find new business, and increasingly they're turning to Africa to look for that business. And if the cost structuring issue can be resolved, it's very likely that Africa can close that energy shortfall quite quickly. I'm Angelo Coppola for CCTV in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Meanwhile, Premier Li Keqiang said on Wednesday that China is willing to cooperate with various countries in the peaceful use of nuclear energy on the basis of equality and mutual benefit. This was announced in a statement at one of two important conferences on nuclear power that kicked off in Beijing this week, with participants from around the world talking about nuclear technology, something that could potentially strengthen China-Africa ties even further.
建成了一批高水平的 The 20th Pacific Basin Nuclear Conference kicked off in Beijing on Tuesday, followed the next day by the Nuclear Industry China 2016. The two events attracted over 1,000 delegates from over 40 different countries, and both focused on the utilization of nuclear technology for power production. In China, Generation 3 and 4 nuclear power reactors are now in construction.
China is going to establish a diversified clean energy system, and nuclear energy plays an important role in this sector.
Although debates remain, there's no denying nuclear technology has affected people's lives in many ways. Experts say that it could also play an important role in reducing carbon dioxide emissions.
China is on the right path and understands the benefit of nuclear power, understands that it's a good way to limit carbon emissions.
In pursuing good nuclear technology utilization, cooperation comes ahead of competition, something that could very well work in Africa's favor.
Greenhouse gas emissions, and China and Canada, among other countries, were signatories to the COP21 and Mission Innovation. And really that's about assisting companies, countries, organizations to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions.
Matthew Edwards, CCTV.
Well, we're going to take a short break. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, to help me unpack Africa's nuclear powered options, I have expert guests standing by in Johannesburg, Dr. Kelvin Kem. He's the chairman of the Nuclear Energy Corporation of South Africa. In Beijing, Professor Ho Wen-ping, she's a research fellow at the Institute of West Asian and African Studies. And with me here in Nairobi, Bassett Buyuka, he's the Director of Publicity and Advocacy at the Kenya Nuclear Electricity Board. Thank you all for joining in this conversation. Dr. Kem, to you first, though we are talking about nuclear power here, energy for Africa. First, it is largely unexploited. What is the extent of nuclear power use in Africa?
Well, Africa is very large, of course. You know, Africa is far larger than Europe. Africa is the size of the United States, China, Europe, India, all added together. So we want to remember that we've got to look at African challenges very differently to the way in which the Europeans and others have looked at theirs. So we've got wide open spaces and large distances to cover. At the moment, South Africa has a nuclear power station which has been running for 30 years. That's a 2,000 megawatt station, and the large stations of 2,000 to 4,000 megawatts, for example, need to be by large volumes of water for cooling purposes. So the 3 new nuclear power stations that South Africa is planning to build will all be on the coast. However, there's a whole new generation called Generation 4 of nuclear reactors that are about 100, 200, 300 megawatts, which is about 5% the size of the big power stations. And they do not need to be on the coast. They can be anywhere inland, and those are ideal for expansion, not only into Africa, but many other places in the world as well.
All right. Bassett, of course, Kenya has also made its own plans to go nuclear by, as you mentioned earlier, 2027. What's Kenya's experience?
Kenya's experience is that we are looking at various options. He's just alluded to the small modular reactors of maybe 300 megawatts that may not need to be at the coast. But we're also looking at the larger ones, 1,000 megawatt technology, and looking at potential sites for this. We have done a pre-feasibility study, and currently we are developing the legislation required for a regulator for the nuclear energy sector in Kenya. At the same time, recently we had the International Atomic Energy Agency carry out an assessment of Kenya's progress. This process is known as Integrated Nuclear Infrastructure Review. And the results of that, of course, will be handed over officially to the government of Kenya later this month of April. All
right. Professor Ho Wen-ping, of course, China is quite a leader in this field, and a lot of African countries are looking now to borrow from China's experience. What's been China's experience?
Yes, China has already built on a lot of experience and also capacity for nuclear power development. So we are also willing to cooperate with African countries to develop Africans' capacity for their nuclear power generation. So actually we have done very good cooperation with South African counterpart already. I think with this very ambitious plan, like South Africa, Kenya, including also Nigeria and Ghana, I heard a number of other African countries also want to catch up to join this plan. So even with Kenya, I think not long ago, China-Kenya has signed the MOU for the nuclear power development cooperation. That venue even has been taken place in Guangdong, Daya Bay, yes, to sign the MOU. So China now has this strong willingness, and also we have capacity, capital, and also technical know-how and expertise. So all of that now China, I think, is ready.
Right. Dr. Kem, though, if I could come back to you as well, because South Africa remains the only country on the continent that is so far making use of its nuclear energy there, though. What would you say would be the advantages, though, for going nuclear?
Well, you know, a lot of African countries are 100% hydro or nearly 100% hydro. And the problem with that is that if it doesn't rain, they start to lose electricity output. Now, African lakes are very large in surface area and relatively shallow in comparison to ones in Europe. And we can easily have droughts in Africa that last a year or two. So what happens is if a dam here or a large lake loses a few meters of water off the dam, which is quite easy, then you can lose electricity output. Now, you cannot build an economy on the basis that you may or may not have all of your electricity dependent on whether it rains. Now, because of the wide spaces I mentioned before, railing coal all over the continent and so on is just not an option in many cases. So what that leaves you with is nuclear as the only option. Things like wind and solar have their place in certain minor applications, I believe, but you've got to find where the wind blows and the sun shines only, of course, during the daytime. So it's my firm conviction that small modular reactors and larger reactors, like the Kenyan gentleman said, of 1,000 megawatts and so, are very much an answer for Africa. The fuel is very price specific as well, in the sense that the price does not vary much. Even if the uranium price were to double, it makes very little difference for nuclear because so little fuel is used. So you can predict well into the future that you are comfortable with what the fuel price is. Whereas if the coal price or oil price or something were to double, that's a major disaster if you're using coal or oil.
We're going to come into that. We're going to come into
nuclear as a.
We're going to come into the whole question of cost there in just a moment, but I want to rip you in here, Bassett, of course, because Dr. Kem has talked about nuclear now almost becoming one of the only options for Africa. Kenya itself has invested quite heavily in the past, in recent years, on geothermal. What's Kenya's view?
Geothermal is the immediate future for Kenya, simply because to also get nuclear, we must build up our total capacity. Currently, Kenya stands at 2,300 megawatts. One nuclear power plant, 1,000 megawatts. And to have it within that energy mix, you must increase geothermal. We must embrace the coal, the plans for the coal plants in Lamu. Those are going afoot. There are also plans for some gas-powered nuclear power plants. And further down the road, nuclear comes in. By the time nuclear comes in, 1,000 megawatts should also be a proportion of the entire generation mix.
What does Kenya see, though, as the long-term advantages of nuclear?
Nuclear will give us several advantages. Number one, it is a very stable baseload. This means that for industry, you're guaranteed power 24/7. In terms of operational costs, it gives a very competitive tariff, because as the professor said, uranium is abundant, it's cheap, it's very affordable. So as a fuel source, we'll be on a very good footing there. In addition to that, industry will be assured people can plan for their industries in the long term.
Right.
Hydro, which we use at the moment, of course, vagaries of weather. In terms of solar and wind, we know that they can all be used for specific situations. So our future must be pegged on geothermal, must be pegged on coal, and of course nuclear.
Right. Professor Ho En Ping, do you agree though that nuclear is fast becoming one of the only options for Africa?
Well, I agree with that, but maybe we cannot say it's the only option. I think multiple resources are more and also the best way for African to handle, because the starting point for African countries to develop its nuclear power system, I think is not high. Actually, it's quite low. In order to build a nuclear power system, you need number one, the lots of investment. So the money issue, the cost issue is a reality you have to face. Even though in the long term, when that nuclear power operation now has been on the run, maybe you can lower those costs. Because in South Africa, like Namibia, those Niger, they have lots of uranium. But at the beginning, and also in the midterm, it also needs a lot of investment. Second challenge, I think, is expertise and also the technical know-how. Nowadays, I know that Kenya has already sent some technicians to like South Korea to get some training. And South Africa and China and even including Russia has all involved in this technical training. But it also takes time. And another is those policy issue. Transparency and how to, because this is quite high technology, the benchmark is not low, it's quite high. So a lot of difficulties, I think. You have to handle that. At the meantime, you have to still make full use of those hydropower, and then also that wind and the solar, because sunshine is so rich resources in Africa.
Dr. Kem, and then of course we come to your whole question of cost, because South Africa, according to the latest statistics, wants to spend about $30 to $100 billion between now and 2030. That whole cost could be quite prohibitive for many African countries there. How expensive is nuclear technology vis-a-vis geothermal or solar or wind energy?
Well, what you have to do is you have to look at the whole cycle cost. Now, the lady in Beijing is quite correct that there must be a mixture. I'm not advocating nuclear only. Kenya also, as the Kenyan gentleman said, is lucky in that it has geothermal, which it's been pursuing very effectively. So obviously for the short term now, Kenya must pursue that line. But he also mentioned that they're getting nuclear legislation on the books, nuclear regulator. I'm aware of the Kenyan nuclear program, so I know it's well on the way, but it's going to take a couple of years yet. But now, as far as the cost is concerned, one must not get confused with looking only at the upfront capital cost. You must say, what price do you sell the electricity for? Now, in South Africa, our calculations right at the beginning showed that the new nuclear build will cost as much to sell the electricity as it currently costs to sell the coal electricity. In fact, right now, South Africa's cheapest electricity is the nuclear electricity that comes from the Koeberg nuclear power station. We're now reaping the benefit of having built that power station 30 years ago, and is now producing cheap electricity because of the fuel factor, that there's so little fuel required. So one has got to look at that mix and look down the line. Now, around the world, people are having problems with the psychology of facing the somewhat higher capital costs in the front. I also don't really think they're as bad as people make out, because in the case of South Africa, we have a 50% localization target, and I think this must become a worldwide club, so to speak. The nuclear people around the world all tend to collaborate with one another because we're all in the same position. So we would like to see that we manufacture certain pumps or valves or things like that in South Africa, which we can export worldwide. Meantime, of course, we here will be pouring our own concrete, our own roads, and when Kenya builds a nuclear power station, no doubt Kenyans will be pouring the concrete, driving the trucks, building things, so there will not be a 100% import. So you've got to look at your own circumstances and say, what percentage of the total cost will we be employing in our own country right now? Then when you pursue the reactor to the more complex parts, it'll be a collaboration between like the Kenyan officials and then at a high level engineers, scientists and such like, and then hopefully South Africans, maybe Chinese, whoever else. We would love to encourage Kenyans, for example, to interact with South Africa, and I think we all need to work on this together.
I'm going to jump in there because, Ambassador, I want to get your view on another issue. Of course, there's just been a nuclear security summit that just concluded in Washington. And of course, the view now is if Africa is talking about going nuclear, what about the terrorism aspect of it? What about the security aspect of it?
Yeah, Beatrice, one of the key issues that must be considered when setting up a nuclear power program is the aspect of security. Security of the installations, security of the materials. And that is something we are very seized of. Just when you look worldwide, nuclear power plants are highly secured, and they have safety in depth. There are very many aspects of safety put in. It's actually like a barracks. It is very fortified, both in terms of design. They say that when you crash even a 747 into the dome of a nuclear power plant, it's a plane that will split into pieces, but it will not go through the reactor core. So already in the design of the nuclear power plant, there is defense there. So in terms of security, the Kenyan authorities are actually involved in the planning for this. We have the military, the police, they're all part of the greater thinking in terms of a nuclear power program and what it will need.
Right, and I'll come to you, Dr. Kem, because in 2011, of course, there was some disaster in the Fukushima nuclear plant there. The whole question of safety, what's your take on that?
Well, let me first of all make a comment about the Fukushima. There was no nuclear disaster at Fukushima. At Fukushima, total number of people killed by nuclear radiation was 0. Total number of people injured by nuclear radiation was 0. Total private property harmed by radiation was 0. A subsequent United Nations survey on what are the potential long-term negative medical effects from Fukushima came to the conclusion that there weren't any. So Fukushima was not a nuclear disaster. It was hit by the tidal wave, the tsunami, just as many other places were, like the airport, the schools, the shopping centers and so on, and many people on that side of Japan died, thousands, many thousands, because of the water and the earthquake. But Fukushima has been a major media issue because people talk about the Fukushima disaster as if it were nuclear. It was not. The plant has been damaged beyond repair from a financial point of view. The plant won't run again. But it didn't cause any nuclear damage. It was a major overreaction. Now the Kenyan gentleman is quite correct. The nuclear materials are held under heavy security, but also, I emphasize again, there's very little of them. So the Koeberg nuclear plant, to give one an illustration, right. If the Koeberg plant was a coal-fired plant, it would use 6 trainloads of coal every day. In fact, it only uses 1 truckload of nuclear fuel every year. So 10 or 20 years worth of nuclear fuel, spent fuel, can be parked in a garage that would hold a few buses. It's not a major volume. And also, of course, when the stuff comes out of the reactor, it's radioactive. So for somebody to steal it, they'd have to know exactly what they were doing, they'd have to know exactly where to find the material and be in a position to carry out highly radioactive material. It's rather difficult. So right. There again, one must look at the potential terrorism angles and secure it. But we know what they are, and I think the people dealing with it in numbers of countries are very well aware of it. So I don't see that as a bigger problem as many people make out.
Right. And of course, Professor Ho Wen-ping, Premier Li Keqiang, though, during remarks that he made to the 20th Pacific Basin Nuclear Conference that has just been taking place in Beijing, he did talk about the Chinese government attaching great importance to the development of nuclear power in a safe and efficient manner, and that China will cooperate with other countries. What do you foresee?
I will foresee a lot of new nuclear power. Those projects will be undertaken between China and the relevant African countries, because now, as I mentioned before, there is increasing demand and the willingness from African side. Not only those leading economy like South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, now even other. I think African countries like Morocco, Senegal, those countries, they're all eager to join this cooperation. Because considering this increasing demand, and also given that the situation China has been enjoying, now China is the #1 those nuclear power generating country, so we have lots of experiences for building this. And also the safety issue, security issue has been carefully taken into consideration. Those technical know-how, I think, is very matured. We haven't seen those nuclear, disasters happening from very beginning even until now. Right. So given all of those situations, I think I foresee a very bright future for this cooperation.
Right. Dr. Kem, I'm going to put this to you. Do you think, or do you foresee nuclear being a viable and favorable alternative for Africa in the long term?
Absolutely. The lady made the point that there's a direct correlation between social growth, economic growth, and electricity consumption. So Africa desperately needs the electricity. They've got to have the electricity. So the question is, how do you get it? And the nuclear is a very good option. Essentially, all African countries can go nuclear immediately, in the sense that, as the Kenyan gentleman pointed out, you've got to get legislation on your books, you've got to get a regulator. There's a few years' worth of work to start before you actually start pouring concrete and so on. So everybody can start now by getting all the legalities and the procedures and that right. Now, also the cooperation is something that's very important. South Africa has signed a student cooperation deal with China, in which 250 South African postgraduate students are going to China to study there. This has already started. We value that collaboration. Just a month ago, we held the annual Nuclear Africa Conference near Johannesburg. We had a major contribution from China, Chinese delegations, senior Chinese people that were here in a spirit of collaboration. And that's very good for us to see. And in turn, South Africa would very much like to be seen to be collaborating with other African countries so that we can all together look towards a future where we put nuclear power into the continent. I think it's absolutely essential. There's no doubt about it.
As we look into the future, Bassett, you have the final word on this.
Yes. What I'll say is we are building the capacity of Kenyans to be able to be very useful in terms of nuclear power generation. We got students who will be going to China in the not too distant future, Harbin Engineering University in China. Of course, we had the partnership between Kenya Nuclear Electricity Board and the China General Nuclear Power Corporation, and we expect to be able to use this for technology transfer. We expect to use this to be able to expose to the technology they have and see how we can assimilate that into our own program and objectives as we also look to what technology we'll be able to use. So nuclear power for Africa is something that has reached its time, and we need to actually ensure it happens. And of course, most nuclear builds now in the world are in China. So we can learn a lot from China as well.
And we'll leave it there for the moment on this program for this week. But thank you all to my guests for their insights. In Johannesburg, Dr. Kelvin Kem, he's the chairman of the Nuclear Energy Corporation of South Africa. In Beijing, Professor Ho Wenping, she's a research fellow at the Institute of West Asian and African Studies. And with me here in Nairobi, Bassett Buyuka, he's the director of publicity and advocacy at the Kenya Nuclear Electricity Board. Remember, you can join the conversation online now through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do join us again next week for another edition of Talk Africa. Goodbye.